Hey guys, welcome back to Falcon Central Radio, part of the Pro Football Central Radio Network. I am your host, Aaron Freeman, joined as usual by my co-host, Matt Karoly. We are going to be recapping this Falcons win over those hated New Orleans Saints. We're going to be talking about the coaching changes that happened during the bye week and sort of what impact that may or may not have had on the Falcons win this past Sunday. Of course, we'll talk about some roster moves. We'll give you some injury updates about Devontae Freeman and Austin Hooper. And of course, we'll talk a little bit about this upcoming matchup with the Carolina Panthers in week 1. So, Matt, let's jump into it as we often do on this show, starting off with any sort of roster moves. Tuesday is always Falcons adjusting their roster day. Since we last did our episode, we know that Ito Smith, the Falcons' backup running back, is on injured reserve, having suffered multiple concussions this year, 2, in fact, in over a month span. He cleared the concussion protocol a week or so ago, but still was dealing with apparently a neck injury. The Falcons added Sean Harlow, my boy, from the practice squad to the 53-man roster. And today they wound up replacing Sean Harlow's spot on that practice squad with a running back, Craig Reynolds, who was an undrafted free agent with the Washington Redskins this summer and played at Kutztown. And of course, the Falcons worked out a couple of edge rushers as well today, Eli Harold and Marcus Smith, to add to the list of edge rushers that they worked out about 3 weeks ago, right before the trade deadline. So, Matt, jump in and sort of which roster moves that you want to particularly focus on.
Well, first, I'll let your mispronunciation of Kutztown, since it's a school near me, slide, but it's a D2 school. It was interesting to see Craig Reynolds go there. I have a couple friends that went there, but not sure we'll see him. I think they're going to ride with Hill, and I think we might see some of Quadri Allison finally, hopefully, in the next couple of weeks, because it does look like Devontae's going to miss a couple games. Unfortunate for Ito, being a lost season for him. But I think this is best for him and his long-term health moving forward, to just shut him down, get him right, and hopefully he's healthy and rejuvenated for 2020. Because I do think whoever the future coaching staff, if it's still Quinn or if it's a new regime, I think he is going to factor in. I think they are going to like his skill set enough to make him a part of a committee, or maybe even make him a lead dog like he was at Southern Mississippi. So wish him well. And now we're going to get to see, like we talked about the last couple shows, we're finally going to get to see what Hill looks like as an RB1, what potentially, Quadri Allison looks like, splitting time in that role. So I'm excited to see that. As for the edge rushers, I was wondering this myself over the weekend, just looking at the roster and looking at the fact that, you have a couple guys that they brought up in Harlow, into Adam Mariner, that are really just stopgaps and not necessarily going to be guys that are going to occupy, I don't think, roster spots for the rest of the year. So I thought maybe, bringing in a fourth edge to replace one of those guys, when they get, demoted, makes some sense. And, now they've looked at a total of 6 guys with Eli Harold and Marcus Smith being the latest 2 that they've worked at. So we'll see what they end up doing there. But, one of the takeaways that I saw in the game against the Saints, which we'll, I think, touch on a little bit later, is just the fact that, they didn't necessarily run. They weren't in base defense much. They ran out of the nickel primarily. So given that, I think you do need an extra edge to really, play some of those snaps, or at least, in the early downs, if you are going to run, early downs out of the nickel, to at least spell Vic Beasley, because to have him, in that role, not playing along the edge like he has been in that 5-2 setup, I think it's going to take a toll on him and going to, hurt the defense. So bringing in a guy like Harold or Smith or Ray or Orchard or whoever they end up signing, if they do end up signing any of those guys at all, I think makes some sense, in those early downs. So we'll see what happens there, but it does definitely look like they're interested in bringing a fourth edge onto their roster.
Yeah. Pita Tamapinu, I can't say his last name. They worked him out a couple of weeks ago. If I had to choose among this group, he would be the guy that I would choose, just because I think he has a comparable skill set as sort of Vic Beasley, which is that sort of hybrid, edge linebacker type of player. So if I had to pick there, Eli Harold also has played that role, having played Sam linebacker for the 49ers, a year or two ago. So he has a similar skill set. So we'll have to sort of see how that works out for those guys. But, on the injury front, sort of looking at Devontae Freeman's injury, as you mentioned, and sort of what that's going to do for this team moving forward, I do think it's going to be interesting to sort of see what Brian Hill can do, particularly in pass protection, which is something we discussed a week ago when we talked about reasons or justifications or whatever you want to call it for why the Falcons didn't pull the trigger on the trade for Devontae Freeman before the trade deadline. And I thought Brian Hill, he did it. There was one particular play, I can't remember at what point, I think it was in the second quarter, that he did a really good job picking up a blitz that led to a completion for Calvin Ridley. But there were a couple of other times in the game where he sort of struggled in that regard, blew some assignments there. I know on the opening drive, he failed to pick up a blitz from, I think, Demario Davis, and that led to Matt Ryan getting hit on that play and forcing the Falcons to not be able to convert on a third down, and led to their sort of first field goal, I think. And then, the real big injury, I think, really is going to be Austin Hooper, and sort of how long he's going to be out with the MCL sprain. Maybe it's a 2-week injury, maybe it's a 4-week injury. We'll have to sort of wait and see sort of on what the update is. But that could be a significant blow just because he's been so reliable for this team and for Matt Ryan in particular, sort of as his sort of security blanket over the middle. And, the expectation is that Jaden Graham will be sort of asked to sort of step up. So this is a golden opportunity for Jaden Graham. But, I don't think anybody's under the illusion that either Jaden Graham or Luke Stocker can fill the shoes of Austin Hooper, who
I don't know. My mentions say otherwise on Twitter. People think that Jaden Graham could easily replace Austin Hooper, and now we're going to find out that they're going to be very, very wrong about that. Because, yeah, you're right. I think this is the biggest loss. Field Yates put out a stat today that Austin Hooper is in the top 6 around the league in passer rating when targeted, up there with the likes of Tyler Lockett, Amari Cooper, and those studs. So. This is going to be a loss. I think, this is where Dirk Cutter really needs to get Calvin Ridley going, who's been relatively quiet since that week 2 performance against the Eagles. They're going to need a secondary option. It's been Hooper for the majority of the year alongside Julio, whereas, Ridley's been relegated to that 3rd spot, but Ridley definitely needs to get going again. And we need to see more of what we saw last year with Ridley under Sark. We need that to now carry forward into 2019 with Cutter. So, you're absolutely right. This is going to be the one that stings, and hopefully they can get through because, like you said, we don't know exactly what the timetable is right now. I'm expecting, that Saints rematch on Thanksgiving night is probably, when we can likely see him at the earliest, given that that's 2.5 weeks from now, and rather than rush him back in 2 weeks when you have a short week to follow, I don't think that makes sense. So. That's my projection right now. But, we, like you said, we didn't get any update today on the MRI or the second opinion, I guess I should say. So until we get that, it's tough to say. But right now, I'd lean towards that Saints rematch for him and even Freeman. I think Devontae coming back probably around that timeline is probably when we'll see him too. So I think they can get by with Hill and Quadri and Barner, but I'm worried about how this passing attack is going to look without Austin Hooper now.
Yeah, I don't think the running game is going to be hurt by Devontae Freeman. I'm just worried a little bit about obviously sort of the passing game, and when you double down with sort of Hooper's injury, that's going to be interesting. And sort of that Saints game would be a great time for those guys to come back, but then you're dealing with the short week, so. If they're not 100%, ready to go that sort of Monday, then it doesn't seem likely that they're going to be ready to go on a short week like that. So it could be a situation where we might. I think that the second Carolina game is the week after that one.
I think so. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough. Sort of the Falcons, and this is the opportunity for our favorite offensive play caller in Dirk Cutter, because he's going to have to sort of pick up the slack, because unlike a lot of Falcon fans, you just can't replace a Pro Bowl tight end in Austin Hooper just like that. And And this is where play calling, when you're basically going from a Pro Bowler to what is literally a third string tight end in Jaden Graham, you're going from, I know Devontae Freeman hasn't looked like a Pro Bowler in quite some time, but a starting running back who was essentially your third string running back, who was, or really fourth string if you want to get technical about it. Again, I'm not going to sit here and act like that drop off is huge, but it is one of those things where your play caller, your offensive coordinator is going to have to do a lot more scheming to sort of work around those things than he normally would, where he could just sort of be like, oh, we know exactly what Devontae is. We know exactly what Hooper is, and that we can, plug and play with those guys. And these other guys are untested in a lot of ways. And so we'll have to sort of see what they can do with extended reps. And hopefully our play caller is up to the task of, allowing those guys to shine.
Not to get on a tangent too bit, but don't you think we have a large enough sample size on this at this point on Hill? I mean, again, he hasn't been the guy, because last year when he was it was Tevin Coleman was the number one and he was the number two. But I feel like we've seen enough to know what to expect. Now, can he handle a full games load? Maybe that's where the questions come into play, because, again, I don't know how much they're going to use really Quadri Olson. We saw him active this past Sunday, but it was strictly on special teams. And you would have thought when Freeman went down, we might have seen at least a couple offensive snaps for Olson, but that wasn't the case. So I guess that's my only question for Hill is, can he shoulder the load? And again, maybe they're going to use Barner even more now. I mean, we saw a good bit of usage from him against the Saints, but that's my only question. Don't you think we've seen enough to know that he can at least be in a committee? But can he?
Yeah, no, I think Hill is competent. I guess for me, like watching the film, obviously the pass protection stuff, as I mentioned,
yeah,
and then there was a couple of runs there where I thought his vision wasn't great, but I don't think that's like a deal breaker or anything. Like, oh, that means Brian Hill's gonna get out there and get 15 carries and rush for like 12 yards or anything ridiculous like that. I just, I do wonder sort of, if the Falcons are going to lean on their running game. It's not to say that I don't think Hill is capable of doing the job. It's just I am not confident that the Falcons will be able to lean on the running game in the next couple of weeks, particularly because the block. Maybe we'll talk about this later with the possibility of Chris Lindstrom coming back. But to me, the blocking is still the same issue that they were dealing with Devontae, and I think we saw that in the second half against the Saints this past week, where pretty much anytime Hill tried to run it up the middle, he was pretty much stuffed for
he had to fight for everything he got in that second half on a lot of those runs. Yeah.
So it's not really a judgment on Hill. It's just more just like I don't see him really moving the needle all that much forward, even though I think he does have a little bit more juice, particularly on those outside runs. So if that's what the Falcons are going to decide to do, to cater more to him,
that would be nice.
So be it, but again, that kind of goes where the play caller has to sort of step up and figure out what he wants to do and sort of, if he's got to tailor the offense to Brian Hill, then maybe that's something that we'll see this upcoming week. So who knows? Yeah.
And I mean, circling back to your point, I think it's a great segue for the all 22 stuff we're about to get into. Dirk Cutter's going to have to step his game up because, having Freeman out, having Hooper out, I mean, that's arguably two of your top four weapons now on the Falcons. So play calling is going to have to shoulder more of the load. And, while the defense was spectacular and the reason they won, in my opinion, there wasn't much to like from the offense. I mean, it was a slow, methodical, we got what the game plan was. It was a time, ball control style to keep Breeze and that offense off the field. And it worked, but, settling for 4 field goals isn't great. There weren't a lot of big plays. The one we're going to highlight right here, which this was the best, thing Dirk Cutter had going for him, was this crossing pattern to Julio Jones late in the first half that put 3 points on the board. It was great to see the Falcons kind of take advantage of the other team on these crossing routes because, God knows how many times the opponent has done it to the Falcons. And you'll see here, I don't know if this is the best angle. The other angle, you'll see the two Saints guys kind of collide into each other. Watch when, Julio and I believe it's Hooper. Right there, both you see the guys collide, bump into each other. That allows Julio the space he needs to break free, and then he gets a nice block downfield from Ridley. So it was nice to see something like this. It wasn't quite a Yankee concept, which we talk about, and something that Kyle Shanahan used so often back when he was here with great success. It wasn't exactly that play, but it was similar. And again, I guess that really wasn't play action per se, but it was enough of a look to again, this is the type of stuff we want to see more of Cutter, and it hasn't happened as much as we'd like. But this was certainly a nice play, and it did lead to some points on the board. And hopefully, you get more scheme plays like that where you're causing confusion and you're causing kind of rub routes against the defense to scheme wide open looks. I mean, that's going to be what's going to be needed to carry this offense these next couple of weeks with Freeman and Hooper out.
And I also want to make note of Devontae Freeman doing a good job helping Luke Stocker out to chip Cameron Jordan, which allows Matt Ryan to step up in the pocket. And these are the types of things that Brian Hill's going to have to do to help out this offense, in addition to what he does when he's asked to carry the ball.
Yeah. So the offense, it wasn't spectacular, but it like we said, it did enough to get the W. Jumping over the defensive side of the ball, one of the big storylines was some of the coaching reshufflings and Raheem Morris going back to the defensive side of the ball, coaching the DBs, certainly had his imprint on this game. There was very few, if at all, any coverage breakdowns. And I think that had a lot to do with, marrying the coverage with the pass rush. And on this particular instance, the Falcons use a 3-man rush, which, none of us have really liked to. No one ever likes to see a 3-man rush, but this was an instance where it was effective and the execution was good. I mean, you'll see it here from this angle. Drew Brees wanting to go to his first read. It's a 3rd and 14. He kind of wants to go to that, right up the top at the 50-yard line there, kind of running the curl routes. He wanted to go there, decided outswise because of the fact that, who's that underneath Deion Jones? No,
this is Deion. This is Vic. This is Sheffield.
Sheffield. Okay, Sheffield right there. It's kind of close enough to that passing lane.
Yeah, this right here.
Where again, Brees thinks otherwise, and at that point, he's having to look to his second, third reads. He's feeling a little bit of the heat there, and Grady brings him down for the sack. One of 2.5 on the day. So again, this was probably the one of the 6 where the coverage was very noticeable. Some of the others, the pass rush was just better this week. But here, I mean, you see guys in zone doing their responsibilities, and it led to this sack.
Yeah, as you guys can see, sort of Breeze coming off his various reads, like sort of he's looking up the seam, whether he's looking for Michael Thomas or Traquan Smith. Then he realizes that's not open because Sheffield's. Then he looks to the flat where Zach Line is, but because it's 3rd and 14, Line's not going to have any chance to convert. Then he comes back to the right side, looks in the flat, and then is hopping around. And by then, sort of as Matt said, everybody hates the 3-man rush, but that's exactly why you do it, is to clutter the throwing lanes and force the quarterback to hold on to the ball. And hopefully at that point in time, he'll either check it down and everybody will rally to the ball, or eventually your 3-man rush will get home, as it did on this play.
Right.
So that's why teams run it. Obviously, we know when the Falcons run it, it doesn't rarely works that way. But in this game, the Falcons ran a ton of 3-man rushes, and for the most part, it was pretty effective in this game, sort of doing the things that they wanted to do. So, that's, as Matt said, that's a pretty good segue to sort of talking about the coaching changes. Anything else you wanted to point out, Matt, before we jump into that?
I mean, just the fact that, Breeze did have a couple reads underneath that he could have checked it down to. And, that's something I noticed that, that's been the hallmark the past couple of years of Dan Quinn's defense is allowing the check downs. And that's why running backs have always, led the league against the Falcons in catches and in yards, because he's willing to give that up. And, then you see the speed of the Falcons defense rally to the football. And we saw that in certain instances. There was a play earlier in the game where Breeze checks it down to Zach Line on a 3rd and long, and everyone rallied to the ball and they got off the field. Breeze could have done the same thing here, but he elected, it's 3rd and 14. It's later in the game. He wanted to take more of a chance.
Yeah, they're down 2 scores at that point. There's no, checking it down and punting makes no sense at that point.
Right. So again, you saw the style of defense that the Falcons want to play this Sunday. First time we've seen it all season. And again, that brings us back to the coaching changes because, the reports, Steve Weiss reported yesterday that, Raheem Morris took over the third down play calling, whereas Ulbrich had been calling the first and second downs since week 6 against Arizona. So for me, my thoughts are, obviously the players deserve a lot of credit because they did the job, they executed. But if I was to give it to any one particular coach, I definitely think that the switch from Raheem Morris going from the wide receiver room to the DB room certainly paid early dividends right now. And we want to get your thoughts on it. So, we're going to open up the phone lines pretty soon here. So call in, give us your thoughts. Do you want to credit Ulbrich? Do you want to credit Raheem? Do you just want to credit the players? So we'll talk a little bit about that, here, Aaron. I want to get your thoughts on what you think. But, yeah, we want to hear from you as well, the people, what you thought about the defensive reshufflings.
Yeah, so for those of you wanting to know how you can join in, if you're watching us on YouTube Live, there is a link in the chat, and you can just sort of click that, jump in, whether you're on computer, whether you're on laptop, whether you're on your phone. All we that he asks you do is sort of silence your whatever you're listening to the show live on. If you can mute that so that we don't get sort of an echo or anything like that. And, come in, ask your questions so that, because we're expecting, hopefully, that we'll get a number of people. So we don't want to necessarily bog things down with too many people waiting in the green room and whatnot to join the show. So, come in, ask your question or, make your comment or whatever it is that you want to talk about, then we'll respond to it and get you in and get you out. So, yeah, I think you're right. It's one of those things where with the coaching changes, one of the things I noticed this week when I actually went today and actually charted the coverage, they used a lot more cover 2, which is something I've been calling for several weeks, really since that Arizona game where they started mixing it more into their coverage looks. And it's been pretty effective. What was interesting in this game, however, even though they used a lot more cover 2, particularly in those 2-minute offense moments at the end of the half where supposedly, according to Steve Weiss, Raheem Morris sort of took over the play calling in those instances. So they relied a lot more on cover 2, but there were 2 sort of interesting wrinkles is that their cover 3 actually worked this game. Like it was actually their most effective coverage, which hasn't been the case really since like week 2 when Keanu Neal was healthy, that their cover 3 has actually been pretty effective as far as I can tell. Because that was really where they were getting gashed for a lot of the big plays that, the whole idea behind playing zone is to give up the short stuff, give up the check downs and whatnot. Don't give up the big plays. But the way that the Falcons have been playing their zone is they've been giving up a ton of big plays. Now, the thing that they've done well is when they've played cover 2, they haven't really given up the big plays in that regard. And that was one of the reasons why I thought maybe playing more of that. And in this game, they kind of gave up a little bit more when they played cover 2 this week. But what are the other interesting wrinkle that I saw rewatching the coverages was that normally when the Falcons play man coverage, they just play cover 1 man. And that gives you an opportunity to have one free defender, usually the middle linebacker like Deion Jones, to sort of spy the quarterback. Or if it's somebody else, safety or somebody else, you usually get a free defender to sort of keep the quarterback in sight. And this week, probably because they're not really worried about Drew Brees running the ball, I don't think he's actually had a rushing attempt all season long. They decided to go cover 2 man, which can leave you vulnerable to run by a quarterback because no one's checking him. But that cover 2 man was somewhat effective. And that's an interesting wrinkle. And I know, Matt, you personally believe that, the safety duo of DeMonte Casey and Ricardo Allen is the best usage. That's, again, another reason why I sort of been pushing for them to use more cover 2 because it just better fits their personnel than playing the cover 3 zone. Because without Keanu, without Keanu Neal or a player of his ilk, or, maybe Sherrod Eastman, I don't know. But, without that type of strong safety, the cover 3 doesn't really work all that effective, particularly with guys like Kamal Ishmael. And we saw a slight improvement with Jamal Carter in there, but that started to get exposed in that Rams game. So, Matt, explain, sort of where you're at with the safety look.
Well, I do have a question for you then. But yeah, I agree. As far as having, KZ back at safety, having Allen, his partner there, I think the cover two makes sense because, again, in that duo, you're not going to have Devontae Casey necessarily be a strong safety. You want to keep him, in the deeper parts of the field, and that's what Allen's been doing for the majority of his Falcons career. So, having them be in that cover two, rather than, Allen taking a third of the field now, he takes, one deep half, and Casey takes another deep half. So again, it's stuff they're comfortable doing. It's stuff they've done in the past. So that's why I think the cover two makes a lot of sense. But I was curious, you mentioned the cover three having it's the most success that it's had all season. I'm assuming Allen was down in Neal's role in those looks. What did you make of him? Because another reason why I do like, Ricardo Allen as the strong safety in that setup is, instincts are some of his best traits, his attributes. So to put those instincts close to the ball, I think makes sense. You'll get more out of him there. And then I think he's such a great tackler that, putting him closer to the line of scrimmage, putting him closer to the ball, makes a lot of sense. You'll get a lot of dividends, rewards from that. So that's another reason. And I'm curious to get your thoughts with him closer to the line of scrimmage, him in that Keanu Neal role. I guess he did well then, if that's what you're saying. They had some of their most success in the cover three look with him at strong safety.
Yeah, I mean, it was one of those things where they were successfully able, for the most part, when they were playing cover three, it was basically the Saints were either throwing it to Michael Thomas, who was basically running circles around Isaiah Oliver, or they were just checking it down to the running backs, which is sort of the idea behind what you want from cover three, which, as Matt alluded to, is why the Falcons always seem to give up a ton of receptions to, running backs year in and year out, because that's really the vulnerability of the cover three. It's just like it leaves sort of the middle underneath for those checkdowns to running backs. And so I wouldn't necessarily say, like, I think the issue that they'll have to deal with sort of playing more cover three is what you're talking about with Allen, where he's not really that box run thumper. But when you're playing nickel, which is what they were doing when they did that, I think you're willing to trade that off because you're really gearing your defense more towards the pass. So you're not necessarily as worried about that. And again, Ricardo Allen does a really good job from the instinctual standpoint, as you mentioned, to sort of cover that ground. Obviously, he's not sort of the player and the playmaker that Keanu Neal is. He's not the thumper. He doesn't quite have the range, but he can sort of fit that role as because of the instincts that he has, and being able to sort of anticipate some things and be in a position to make some open field play. So it was effective, as I mentioned, and it'll be interesting to sort of see if this was just kind of a one-off sort of thing. Is it because the Saints offense is so geared towards, basically Michael Thomas and Jared Cook and Alvin Kamara, and you didn't really, take in, and Traquan Smith and Austin Carr and all these other guys really did next to nothing in this game. Pretty much every time Drew Brees threw it to one of those guys, they dropped the ball, it seemed like. So maybe it's specific to the Saints, but it's certainly something to keep an eye on. And going back to sort of the coaching thing, like, because they were so many of the big plays that they gave up when they played cover three previously were due to mental errors and mental breakdowns. And one of the things that we heard after the game was, with Raheem Morris's moving to that side of the ball, that they did a better job with that. They were better prepared. He was talking about different techniques and certain things that they were doing to sort of gear themselves to what the Saints like to do offensively. So, it goes back to what Matt said. I think Raheem Morris does deserve a lot of credit if this, particularly certainly for this game, and we'll have to sort of see if this is a trend that continues in the coming weeks, and if the Falcons can get back to playing the style of football that they want to play, which is featuring still a lot of zone and playing that bend but don't break style of defense. And when you have the pass rush playing to the level that they did this week, and they'll have another opportunity against a Carolina offensive line that is vulnerable. We saw that with the Packers this past week. So everything is there for the Falcons to at least return to a level of defensive play that we've grown used to. Whether that's a good defense or just kind of an average defense is certainly something that I'm sure others will debate. But if we can get that sort of level of competence from this defense, then it gives this team a lot better chances to win some games in the second half of the season, which brings its own set of issues for all the people that want to tank out there and get the highest possible draft pick. But at least we'll have something interesting to watch on Sunday at the very least.
Right. I mean, how crazy is it that two of the best performances by the defensive line occurred against arguably two of the top 5 offensive lines in football, with that being the Eagles and the Saints. I mean, Eagles offensive line's balling out, looking like the best. And, they had a lot of success against them, both against the run and constantly, putting Carson Wentz under duress. And then this past week against the Saints, they have 2 all-pros, arguably, in Armstead and Ramczyk. And even their rookie center is playing well. And, 35% of Drew Brees dropbacks, he was under pressure. So, again, now we're looking for the consistency. I mean, we saw the potential. They finally played to their potential. And, a lot of it, I think, does have to do with some of these coaching reshufflings. Because, again, Raheem Morris calling the third down looks, and the Saints were 3 of 12 in third downs. And, in those third and long situations, time and time again this season, we saw the Falcons fail to get off the field in those instances. And this past week was a totally different story. They played to their style. They didn't give up anything deep. They forced the check downs and rallied to the football. And in certain instances, when Drew Brees didn't want to opt for the check down, they took away that first and second look, and the pass rush was able to get home. So they have the formula. This is the formula. And, now facing, they got 5 more division games on the docket. Historically, Dan Quinn, since his rookie season, has been good in the division. I think 4-2 is his worst mark in a season, again, since his rookie season. So, they might have a couple wins up their sleeve now. And yeah, you're right. I mean, we might be, the narrative might be shifting, and we might not be talking about embracing for Chase, but embracing for, this difficult decision that Arthur Blank has to make if they finish strong. So, maybe we'll take the conversation there. Doesn't sound like we got any callers yet, but we want to hear from you. What was your biggest takeaways from this past week's game? What's your thought process on Dan Quinn? Certainly, Aaron, want to get your thoughts on that as well. But I'm certainly in no shape or form flipping on that. I still think, as we mentioned in past shows, they have to run the table in my mind for Dan Quinn to really have a shot. I don't think another 7-9 season is going to cut it. Just based on history, based on Arthur Blank, firing every coach that's missed the playoffs 2 consecutive years. But if we start seeing more of what we saw on Sunday going forward, then, I don't know. Arthur said he wanted to evaluate stuff over these next couple of weeks. And this past Sunday was a step in the right direction for Dan Quinn's stock.
No, I think you're right there. For me, I don't want to get too far ahead of us, because we were basically saying this exact same thing right after that Philadelphia game, when, all jazzed up. Oh yeah, we beat the Eagles. Yeah, we stopped them. And so, I need to see them play well for 2 weeks in a row, because
it'll be interesting how the players react here, because after that Eagles game, they were feeling themselves, and now they're 2-7. Are they? I mean, they played well, but hopefully they're not feeling themselves, and they're just like, all right, let's get back to business and replicate what we just did this past Sunday. But it'll be interesting to see what the vibes around the locker room are as we get the reports from the beat writers this week.
Yeah, and obviously we're not going to look at Carolina's offense the same as we look at the Saints' offense, but Carolina's not an offense like they can beat us. Like
sure.
Based off of how we've played for most of the season. DJ Moore probably will run circles around Isaiah Oliver. Is why I think you want to get Desmond Trufant back this week. And allow him to cover DJ Moore, and then have Kendall Sheffield going up against Curtis Samuel. Seems like a pretty favorable matchup there. And Kyle Allen, he's gonna bring a lot more mobility to the table than Drew Brees is going to bring. And he can make some plays with his legs, and obviously we know Christian McCaffrey can do a lot. Maybe the Falcons benefited greatly because Alvin Kamara wasn't 100% this past week. So it's one of those things where, I think you nailed it, Matt. Sort of, if they're feeling themselves and being like, oh yeah, we beat the Saints, we can beat anybody, and like, yeah, we all think they can. They're capable of beating any of these teams left on their schedule, but they have to put in the work in order to do so. They just can't, get complacent all of a sudden and think, and I think a lot of people may get a little bit, from a fan standpoint, get complacent, thinking like, oh, we beat the Saints, so we can pretty much beat anybody. So we do have a caller here, one of our usuals in Justin. How you doing tonight, Justin?
I'm good. How are you guys?
Good, Justin. Good to hear from you.
What you got for us?
I just want to ask you guys about Dan Quinn. Let's just hypothetically say the Falcons finish like 6-2 in the second half of the season. They lose at San Francisco. Maybe they lose to the Saints on Thanksgiving. And the defense looks better. And like the main problem is the offense with Dirk Cutter refusing to run play action and the Falcons getting behind in games. If that were to happen and you think the offense is more of the problem, do you think there's a chance Dan Quinn will keep his job then if the defense makes strides?
Yeah, that's, as I just got done saying it's going to be a tough decision if that's the way things finish up and the defense does show strides and, they finish 6-2. So that would leave them at 7-9. And you bring up Cutter and that's my thing that I posed on Twitter today. It's like, I'd feel somewhat okay with it if Cutter was gone, but I don't know if Dan, unless like Arthur Blank said, hey, yeah, you got to get rid of Cutter, which I don't know if that's necessarily something he would do or be proactive or forward thinking enough to realize that. But that's the only way I feel somewhat comfortable because I can't deal with, seeing Cutter. I mean, he's basically neutered this offense. They've taken even farther steps back from Sark, which, I don't think anyone thought that, that would happen, but here we are. So for me, that's what it comes down to is if, he's willing to move on from Cutter. Because either way, if people are concerned that Falcons would be on their fourth offensive coordinator, whether Quinn stays or goes, you're going to have a different play caller. So I don't think that's a big deal. I think the big deal is getting the right guy in the building, and Cutter's not that guy.
From my perspective, I don't think Dan Quinn can save his job. Really, I think the scenario that would require would be next to impossible. Like I think they would have to run the table. I think they would have to find a way to make the playoffs, which is pretty much impossible with a couple more wins from teams like Minnesota and Seattle. Like basically. The best case scenario the Falcons could finish is like 9-7, and Seattle and Minnesota have tiebreakers over them. The Rams have a tiebreaker over them. So it's one of those things where I just think it's pretty much impossible for Dan Quinn. I think the decision has been made. I think it's really just about Dan Quinn going out with some dignity at this point in time and finishing the season strong. But it's so, to me at least right now, and maybe if the Falcons rattle off 2 or 3 wins in a row and look really good doing so, maybe I can revisit that sort of opinion at that point in time. But it feels so much like to me with Mike Smith, where people were talking about him in that second half of the season because they started that year like 1-6 or something like that, or 2-6. And then we're in the playoff hunt because the NFC South was so bad that year, still going into the season despite having a losing record that year. And then it came out like everybody was like, okay, well, the Falcons win that Week 17 game against Carolina, they'll make the playoffs, and they'll maybe Mike Smith will keep his job. And then the news came out like the Sunday morning before that Week 17 game that Arthur Blank had already hired a coaching firm to sort of search for the new head coach. So it was even clear at that point that he had already made his decision to hire a new coach, even though the Falcons were still in the mix. So I really kind of think it's pretty much a done deal at this point, that it's really just Dan Quinn doing the best he can to save face and, go out with and maybe at least get a couple of butts in the seat, toward the end of the season so that Arthur Blank could be like, yeah, we're going to get a new coach and we finished the season strong and we'll ride that momentum and, buy those PSLs, whatever he sort of is on his mind moving forward. But I don't think there's really any realistic scenario where Dan Quinn will keep his job, even if the defense plays well down the stretch. And, we sort of look at it and say, yeah, Dirk Cutter is the problem more so than the defense at that point.
But then another argument, I think, for him to lose his job is that as the Falcons are taking more and more power away in the defensive play calling from Dan Quinn, it seems to be getting better, because at halftime of the Arizona game, they would have Olbrich call the first and second down defense. And I think maybe in the Rams and Seahawks game, the defense was a little bit better. And then obviously last week, Raheem Morris helped with the communication in the secondary and then third down in the 2-minute defense. And I just feel that as Dan Quinn is giving away more and more of the play calling duties, the defense seems to be getting better. So doesn't that mean that if you have other people other than Dan Quinn getting more power, the defense gets better? Doesn't that mean that he's not doing a good job?
Yeah, I was going to say, is there something to be said for the fact that now he's not really the one controlling the outcome, and they're having more success doing it? That's an indictment on Dan Quinn, I think, in my mind, and I think that's a good point. I mean, again, we've talked about him as an X's and O's guy, and he had that opportunity to start the season in that role, and it blew up in his face. And now that he's delegated some of those roles, the Falcons are having success. So I think that just goes to show you what does Arthur Blank need to keep Dan Quinn around for? He's not the key piece here. He's not the reason that they're having success or turning it around.
Yeah, I mean, the way you can think about it is the two coordinators that Dan Quinn hired, one of them he's already fired, which is himself, the defensive coordinator, and pretty much most of us, I'm sure there's a couple of crazy people out there, probably think that Dirk Cutter deserves to be fired, barring, a massive turnaround in these last 7 games this season, and the offense starting to look more like that sort of Shanahan or peak Sark level offense that's, dropping 30 plus points. And again, if you look at the Saints game, 4 field goals, that at least 3 of those probably should have been touchdowns if this offense was sort of clicking in any form or fashion. So, the Falcons, wound up, they scored 26 points, but, that probably should have been like 40 if we're really being honest, if this offense was really clicking in the way that we think it's capable of. So from that perspective, Dan Quinn's already fired his or will eventually fire both of his coordinator choices. So at that point in time, why would you have any confidence that Dan Quinn will be able to pick a new coordinator if he winds up firing Dirk Cutter at the end of the season for 2020? So it would just take some really extraordinary circumstances really at this point in time for me to really buy that Dan Quinn can save his job. But again, that's a conversation that I certainly think is fair to revisit if we, rattle off a couple of wins and look really good, and maybe we can change our mind. But I kind of think it's a done deal at this point.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think Dirk Cutter is the bigger problem with this team right now. And my dream would be for us to hire Josh McDaniels as our head coach next year. I don't think it's going to happen just because he spurned the Colts and what happened with Bobby Petrino back in 2007. But I just think Josh McDaniels could do wonders for this offense, and he can really utilize the pieces the way they could be.
Yeah, I mean, he's up there as far as, some of the more cutting edge guys that are going to be available. But, to the point you said about spurning the Colts and, Arthur Blank possibly having, flashbacks of the Bobby Petrino saga, I too I'm uneasy about that. So that's why he's not up there as one of my top choices. But if he ended up actually leaving New England and signing up with Atlanta, I think it would be, a good move, or at least one of the better options out there. But for me, my top guys are still Bieniemy and, some combination of Kubiak or Stefanski. I'd love Kubiak. It would be a great, save face moment for the franchise to get him. But with his health issues and the reasons they stepped away from the Broncos, I'm not so sure he really wants a head coaching job again. I'm sure he would take, more reins as an offensive coordinator, but I don't see any way that Stefanski and Kubiak would come over in a package deal. I don't think Minnesota would allow that necessarily. So,
Justin, we appreciate your many questions and thoughtful insights into this topic, and we wish you a good night. We got some other people waiting to jump on and join the show, so have a good night, my friend. We'll see you
All
next
right,
week.
you too.
Thanks again, Justin. Appreciate it.
Okay, we have another usual suspect in Johnny. What's going on, my friend?
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
How are you doing, John? What's on your mind?
I'm doing good. Just sitting back listening to you guys. Just relishing over the comments that are made over, the coaching staff and whatnot, and just trying to hold back from not getting too involved in that.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong. You're big on Dan Quinn, but not big on Thomas Dimitroff, correct? Is that where you still fall, or did I get that wrong?
Right.
Do you still? I mean, obviously, we just got done talking about how, we think seeing the coaching staff reshufflings and them having success there doesn't paint Dan Quinn in a great picture. Convince the audience otherwise. Why you think maybe that's not necessarily the case in your mind?
That's impossible. I don't think I could do that, but I don't see how Dan Quinn isn't responsible for the game going the way it did. I mean, the play calling is still the same. It's just, I guess, being chefed out by a different guy. I don't really get.
I mean, I will to that point. I will say, we did see a little bit more cover too. So I will say the play calling was adjusted a little bit, but all in all, I mean, things looked.
Here's my thing. We got a chance to see Davidson sit. I mean, he plays way too much for somebody that doesn't produce. I don't know if I sent Aaron a video of Davidson just getting manhandled. I mean, this guy was just getting pushed 5-6 yards deep into the secondary, and that's just not acceptable in the NFL.
That'll happen from time to time. I will say Davidson has been a good pickup. I mean, he has helped in the run defense. The Falcons have been, a much improved unit in that end where they, last year they were abysmal there. I know, obviously it's gotten in the way of Deidre not seeing the field, but again, I think that would be a different story if Davidson was making, big coin. That's not necessarily the case here. So, while I do want to see Sanat, I think Davidson's been a fine player. We didn't see him as much on Sunday because the team was in a nickel and he doesn't necessarily play in the nickel, but it is what it is. So do you have any questions for us, John? Where are we going with this conversation tonight?
I'm still focused on the defense. It's my most prize. Like, I love the Falcons, but the defense is what I love the most. I want to keep the defense where it is. I know people want to get rid of players, but here's my take. 3-man rush, it's effective. Why? Because you have a guy like Vic Beasley. Will he be there next year? We don't know. You'll have Tack McKinley. He'll be coming off the edge. But he's essentially Vic Beasley, just a little stronger, and that's about it. I mean, he doesn't produce anything.
You're not – I mean, again, you can't – and there's been a lot of fans that do this. You can't just look at the sack numbers with Tack McKinley. I mean, you got to put context into it, and that's why, again, I think this performance highlights the fact that the coverage needs to be paired with the pass rush in order to be effective. Too many times we saw the quarterback go into their first read and it being wide open. You can't pressure the quarterback if you're giving up the first read so often. This past game against New Orleans, that wasn't the case. So that's why it allotted guys like Tack to pressure the quarterback, like Grady to get home on the sacks, like Claiborne. I mean, Tack was the reason Vic Beasley got his final sack. They had a tackle and stunt. Tack's
right, but isn't that the way the defenses?
So Tack's
isn't that the way the defenses ran, where Tack is coming off the edge to force the quarterback in, and Vic is the cleanup?
Lately, we've seen Tack inside. Tack's been, in that, Michael Bennett / Claiborne role where he's been rushing from the interior, and that's what we saw in the tackle and stunt. Whereas he was rushing from the tackle spot, the interior spot. He crashed home on the guard and the tackle, and then broke free, and three blockers had to occupy him, and that left Vic Beasley wide open for that last sack on Breeze. So Tack did all the work. Again, we're seeing him more from the interior, which he had success last year. I know Aaron's been a big fan of that, and you kind of saw why. So again, sure, Tack maybe hasn't taken the jump that we've all expected in year 3, but let's not be fooled in thinking he's not making an impact. It's just not necessarily showing up in the box score.
Right. I'm not I don't want to get rid of Tack. I love him. That's what he's there for, to come off the edge, to force the quarterback to get scared and get off his feet, so where he can't plant and throw. But I mean, if you don't have a guy on the inside, which we don't have as an interior, I mean, you have Grady, but how many snaps could Grady play in a game? You don't want to push him too much.
No, they certainly need to add more pieces. No one's saying that. That's for sure.
Correct.
But John, if you don't have any questions, we do have someone chilling in the green room in Khalil. We want to get him on the show. So, if you have any final thoughts, you want to leave him with us. If not, we're going to have to get you out of here tonight.
Yeah, I'm going to leave you with the last. I stole this quote for somebody, but I just want to leave it out there. It's a big shot is nothing but a little shot that keeps shooting. Have a good night, guys.
I mean, that's what the Falcons defense needs to do.
Yes, sir.
They need to keep stacking it up and consistently put together these efforts. So that's a great parting words, and we appreciate you, John, as always.
All right, John.
Thank you, guys. Have a good night.
All right. We have Khalil. Khalil, can you turn on your mic so we can hear from you?
I'm a big fan of the show.
Hey, Khalil. We appreciate it, man. Thanks for coming on tonight.
What you got for us?
I was wondering, what do the Falcons have to do salary cap wise in order to re-sign Hooper next year, or do you think he'll walk?
So I think he's going to be back. I don't really think it's a question, and I think all the talk about the Falcons being in salary cap hell is a little over exaggerated. There's some easy cuts that they can make. They already got Sanu's contract off the books via trade, so that's going to save them over $6 million next year. I think guys like Schaub and Sombrilo are likely gone to save more money. Then you got other guys that it's not as clear, but certainly guys that are looking like they might not be here. For instance, Devontae Freeman. I think there's going to be a decision made on him. Alex Mack will be an interesting one. He's getting up there in age, and he's not necessarily been the same player, whether it's injuries or, again, just, declining because of age. That could save $8+ million. There's, James Carpenter. There's Alan Bailey. So there's players that they can certainly cut and move on from to save money. And then, there's also the restructures. So guys like Matt Ryan and Jake Matthews, I mean, they can save upwards of $20 million just by doing some simple restructures, kind of moving their money down the road a little bit. But, that's not such a big deal for players that that are going to be around for a long time. So, for me, running the numbers, I've gotten to the point where the Falcons can save, 40 to 50 million pretty easily by doing some of those things. And if they do that, then, Hooper's going to fit in right there. The way I've looked at this all along is, getting rid of Mohamed Sanu, you're basically swapping out his contract for Austin Hooper. So, they had him under the salary cap as is, moving him out, putting Hooper in, it's pretty much the same price tag. So I don't think fans should be concerned about that. I think, again, I've said all along, I think he's next on the list. Falcons have said it recently, which is why, they could have dangled him on the trade market and gotten something big in return, and they didn't do that. And I think that's because, they do want him a part of their future, and I think he will be.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, Matt. I feel like their cap situation has been much ado about nothing. I mean, as Matt mentioned, like you cut Bailey, Sambrilo, Stalker, Schaub, that saves you about $13 million. That gets you under the cap. That's more than enough to re-sign Hooper. I think Hooper 100,000% is going to be back. I think, some weird stuff would have to happen where they hire some Bruce Arians type of coach who refuses to use the tight end and comes in, decides, it's my way or the highway, and I hate tight ends. And, I'm going to let a probable Pro Bowl player wind up walking this season. Like, I think there's like 0% chance that happens. And as Matt said, it's really about the restructures. And Matt and I have talked about this. We were talking about this in the summer. talking about after the season, the Falcons really need to go to Matt Ryan like they did last offseason, and instead of, I think they saved like $7 million last year or this past spring with Matt Ryan. They need to do the max restructure on Matt Ryan, and that frees up $14 million. If you do a similar thing with Desmond Trufant's contract, that frees up another $6 million, and so that creates about $20 million on top of the other money that we're talking about. And then you can, depending on what the new coaching staff, what the new front office wants to do with players like Trufant and Mack and Freeman and Ricardo Allen, and as Matt said, James Carpenter, that can create additional savings. I'm not suggesting that all of those guys are going to be gone, but some of them could be gone. So it's one of those things where I think the Falcons are in a decent cap situation. They're not going to have a ton of money. They're not going to have $80 million to spend or anything, but they should, if they do their jobs, if the new GM or the old GM, whoever is running the show, is competent, then he will do everything in his power to get this team in a position where they can spend a little money and fill whatever the holes that they deem are the holes this offseason, not only in free agency, but then later on in the draft. So I don't feel like the Falcons' salary cap situation is as dire as maybe other people paint it. So I don't feel like that's going to be a major obstacle to prevent the Falcons from doing most of the things that they want to do. I don't know if they're going to be able to go out there and pay someone like a Jadeveon Clowney a $100 million contract or anything like that. But outside of, they get basically, like, if they can create like $40 million in cap space, that's like the equivalent of signing 5 Dontari Poes. That's like the equivalent of signing 4 Grady Jarretts. It's like the equivalent of signing 10 Jack Crawfords. So they can go out there and have enough money to make enough moves this offseason to fill whatever holes that they have, if they want to. You got anything else for us, Khalil?
Yes, one more question. I don't know about you guys, but I've been a little bit more impressed with Sheffield's play on the field than Oliver. Do you think there's any kind of pressure on Oliver for that cornerback 2 spot? Do you think Sheffield will be able to steal it from him, or?
I think he already has. I think the only reason we don't know that is because Trufant's been out. But I think the minute Trufant comes back, Sheffield will 100% be the right cornerback.
Well, I think we do kind of, I don't know if it was the Seattle game or the Los Angeles game, but Sheffield had 100% of the snaps and Ray Wilson and Oliver were splitting. So, yeah, I think you're right. I think he pretty much already has stolen it. And when Trufant comes back, it's going to be him and Sheffield. The only thing I'd say, and yeah, I agree, Clay, I've been impressed with him. I wasn't super high on him as much as I was Jordan Miller, but he's proven me wrong. I mean, his speed's evident, and that's helped him a lot, especially making up on ground when he has, allowed some free releases at the line of scrimmage. What I'll say about him, though, is, we saw some flashes of Isaiah Oliver last year, where it was like it made us feel confident that he can handle the cornerback two role. And I just want to, pump the brakes a little bit. I'm encouraged by what I've seen, but that's why I've been saying I still think cornerback, it could be a top need depending on how the draft board shakes out, in this upcoming draft, because, again, Aaron talked about restructuring Trufant's deal. I'd be a little cautious on that because I don't know how much longer he's going to be here in Atlanta. And when you restructure a guy like that, you make cutting him in the future a little bit tougher. So, with his future uncertain, and again, you're talking about 2, inexperienced guys that sure have shown flashes, and Oliver's taken a step back, and right now Sheffield has looked to be the guy. I don't think that position is any way settled, and that's why I still think this team might need a cornerback 1 in the future. But yeah, I liked what I've seen. I think he is the cornerback 2 right now. Hopefully that continues. But I would say to fans out there, just be a little cautious, because we saw some good things from Oliver, and then year 2, we've seen a lot of bad things. So hopefully Sheffield doesn't have that same future.
Yeah, for me, I guess if I was, the consultant for the Falcons, as I wish I could get paid to do this rather than doing it for free on the podcast.
Right.
But yeah, I think, I wouldn't have an issue restructuring Trufant, because I just think at this point in time, getting that $6 million is more important than worrying about what cap ramifications happened in 2021 or 2022 further down the line. I just think you're going to have enough holes that it's just like, who cares? We'll cross that bridge when we get to it, from a cap standpoint. But I do think because of that, this upcoming season, 2020, there's a pretty good probability at this point, we'll see, that may be Trufant's last year here in Atlanta. And so, I like Sheffield. I like what he's done, but I think really at this point in time, if I'm so far, and we'll see what happens over the next 7 games, but if I'm the next GM, I'm sitting here saying, okay, Trufant's going to be my cornerback 1. Sheffield is going to be my nickel. I need to go out there and get a number 2 corner. And ideally, that's going to be a guy that's good enough that come 2021, if we decide to move on from Desmond Trufant, that could be a guy that steps into that number 1 cornerback role potentially. And, you're not really going to find that in free agency unless you want to go out there and spend the money on someone like a Marcus Peters or something like that. But that's likely going to happen in the first couple of rounds of the draft. And, if you do that, and then Oliver comes on really strong and Sheffield continues to improve and looks like a guy that can be that number 1 corner, then guess what? You have potentially 3 really good cornerbacks, which is a good problem to have. And that's going to allow your defense, whoever's running it, to be a lot more flexible with the various things that they want to do from a schematic standpoint, because they have 3 potential shutdown corners. Or, if Sheffield takes a step back or Oliver continues to struggle as he has this season, then, that new cornerback, that rookie that you'll wind up drafting, is going to be the guy that's going to be the new Desmond Trufant and sort of guide you in the future. So like Matt, I do think cornerback is going to be a big need. I do think Sheffield has the potential to, I won't say like prevent that from being a need, but certainly he'll have an opportunity regardless to, help out this team in the future. And we'll see what he's going to do, over the next couple of seasons.
Yeah, I mean, Sheffield does, his background, if you look at his background, he was the 2nd rated player in Alabama's 2015 recruiting class. So he has the talent. I'm just want to be cautious about it, because we've seen this story before. Sheffield, Oliver, was supposed to be a first round a value, and he was a steal in round 2. And again, he's fallen on hard times a bit, and hopefully he turns it around. And if he does, then Falcons will be in a good position. If he doesn't, then, the hope is Sheffield has to continue on that upward trajectory for the Falcons to, salvage their cornerback room and not have it be an overwhelming hole, and just, a hole that they have to continue to address via the draft and maybe in free agency. But again, his background points that he has the talent to maybe even be a cornerback 1. Who knows? But, as of right now, I'm with Aaron. I think probably cornerback 2 is his peak, and then they'll have to eventually find a cornerback 1 down the road.
Anything else you got for us, Khalil?
Yes, one last question. The chances that Young Ho Koo will be the starter next year, or is he more so just a fill-in for the rest of the season?
I think there's a chance. I mean, he's young enough. Kickers have a similar type of career path that he's had, as far as, bouncing around a few different places before you finally kind of land on your feet, pun intended, and, become a kicker somewhere for a longer term. So I don't think it's out of the realm of possibilities. It's a little early to know, but it was certainly a good debut, being reliable. As we said, the Falcons had to settle for 4 field goals, and he made them all. And some of them were from 40 plus. So there's a chance. I wouldn't rule it out.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a chance. We'll have to sort of see how he performs over these next 7 games. I think right now, barring him being, lights out amazing and making pretty much every kick from here on out to the rest of the season, the likelihood is that the Falcons will probably keep him and bring in some competition, just because, he hasn't really proven himself to be a sort of a reliable guy that you can trust for a full season. He lasted like 4 games with the Chargers a couple of years ago, and we'll see sort of how he performs over these next 7. But it's one of those things where I think right now there's every reason to think that he'll be back next year competing for the job. Whether he wins the job remains to be seen, but certainly I think right now there's a pretty good chance.
My only hope is he doesn't fall victim to the Madden curse, because one of our pals at Vil Terenius did a photo edit of Young-Ho Koo's face on the Michael Vick Madden cover this past week. And I tweeted that out. So that's my only hope is he doesn't fall victim this week to the Madden curse. Because if he does and he misses some kicks, I'm certainly going to at him and be like, it's all your fault, man. You're the one that did this to our guy. So that's the only worry right now with Young-Ho Koo in my mind.
Yeah. There you go. Khalil, we appreciate you joining us, and we hope to hear from you more in upcoming weeks.
Thanks for having me tonight, guys.
Okay, great talking with you, Khalil. Have a good night.
You too.
Thanks.
Okay. We still got some time. We could take a couple more callers, but I guess.
Do we have any chat questions to pull up to talk about?
Yeah, that's what I was looking at. We do have something from Zamir.
Okay.
Let's see. Zamir asked, what top free agent next year you guys would love to see sign with the Falcons? Clowney, perhaps?
Well, we touched on him a bit. He's probably going to be out of their price range, especially if he has more performances like he did last night. For me, it's Eric Armstead, and even he might be out of their price range, but he's a guy I've always liked. In a contract year, he's having his best season with 7 sacks here with the 49ers. Guy who can play up and down the line. So depending on, again, what scheme the Falcons run, and Joe Woods is a D coordinator option for a few of the coaching candidates that I've thrown out there, and Bieniemy and Stefanski/Kubiak. So Joe Woods coming over from San Francisco as their passing coordinator, it would be great if he can bring one of his players there and plug them right in, and they'd probably run a similar scheme to what the Falcons are already running. So that would be great. Again, not sure the money works because, Armstead's having a great year and might make some serious coin, maybe have a Calais Campbell type deal that Campbell got a couple years ago. But right now, again, I haven't sifted through a lot, at least not a lot of big names. There's some, mid-tier guys that I'm sure we'll get to throughout the course of the rest of the year. But Eric Armstead's my one guy that would be sweet if they can get him and put him next to Grady Jarrett.
Yeah, I mean, if we're doing a hypothetical where money is no longer an object, Yannick Ngakoue would be great. That would be amazing. Chris Jones would be amazing.
Yeah.
I like Javon Hargrave. I like Jerron Reed. I like Michael Pierce. Some big time playmaker on the front that can. Shaq Barrett was a guy that I really wanted the Falcons to sign last year. I'm sure he has significantly increased his market value from how he's performed this season. So he would be another guy. Robert Quinn was a guy that I absolutely loved, and kind of he went by the wayside, but it looks like he's had a little bit of a resurgence down in Dallas, right?
Yeah, he's done good there.
He's moved around so much. I was trying to remember, like, is he in Miami or is he with LA now?
Yeah.
But he's another guy. Whitney Merciless would be a nice sort of 1 year stopgap. Maybe help Tack, hone that bull rush a little bit better.
Yeah, that's been my comp for Tack. So yeah, it would be cool to have a guy similar career trajectory, similar type of player teaching him, because I do think Tack he would benefit from having a veteran. So that would be well welcomed. Another one kind of under the radar. Again, he's more towards the back end of his career, but again, if Joe Woods is a potential guy, or even if Joe Woods isn't, Derek Wolfe from the Broncos. Being an interior rusher, I think, with Claiborne, Jack Crawford being free agents, I think an interior pass rusher is going to be a top need, and whether they can plug it in the free agency or the draft, Derek Wolfe could be a guy that I think is actually probably one of the more reasonable guys that we've mentioned here that could actually happen from a money standpoint to plug in next to Grady Jarrett, either in the nickel or the base. So that's a name that I would keep in the back of your minds coming over from the Broncos.
Yeah, and the Clemson pipeline, you keep that going with DJ Reader. He's also, potentially one of the top. Again, these are all guys that are probably going to make a lot of money and potentially price themselves out of the Falcons' range. And I'm certainly, as we sort of get closer to the offseason, Matt and I will sort of come up with our own list of sort of like the value for agents looking for that sort of Shaq Barrett type of player But you probably have a bunch of veteran guys like Ryan Kerrigan and Michael Bennett and some of these guys that probably get cut after the season. So, there's going to be a lot of potential options for the Falcons. As I said, that if they want to be proactive, which I think we all think they should have some opportunities to find some players that can really help out their defense as well as their offense come March. You just mentioned Derek Wolfe and Cody Stokes asked a question about which defensive front do you think the Falcons should use, 4-3 or 3-4?
It's tough. I don't know if it doesn't matter necessarily. Again, they're going to have they don't have a lot of defensive linemen under contract next year, so they're pretty flexible with what they do. It all just comes down to who the coach ends up being. Again, I think a guy like Deidrin Sanat, part of the reason you're not seeing him on the field is a 3-4. He's not a traditional 3-4 nose tackle. He's more of an even front 4-3 nose tackle. So if you want to make the most of him, maybe 4-3 is the answer. So maybe that's where I'd lean. But again, in today's NFL with how prevalent nickel's used, it doesn't necessarily matter a whole lot. And I don't think it matters necessarily with the Falcons personnel, given that they're more or less a blank canvas outside of Tack, Grady Jarrett, and Sanat.
Yeah. I think really the key is going to be if they do decide to run a 3-4, as Matt said, like the differences between the schemes now at this point in time, just because everybody plays nickel, 65 to 70% of the time. And we saw this past Sunday where the Falcons played nickel all but like 7 snaps in this game. So like 90% of the snaps this past week. That's owed to the Falcons having the lead, and hopefully the Falcons offense will get back on track to the point that they will be able to play with a lot more leads in the future. So the nickel is going to be the new base. But I think really the key is, regardless of what scheme they run, if they run a 3-4, they don't need to have a guy like Grady Jarrett out there two gapping, which is, trying to sit there and hold double teams. I think, to Grady Jarrett's credit, I think he's done a much better job doing that this year when he's been forced to do that when the Falcons sort of deploy their defense. But it's one of those things where that's just not what you want to do. And a lot of 3-4 teams now are sort of, not really that sort of traditional 3-4 defense where the defensive ends and nose tackle are just sort of holding the point of attack, waiting to see what the quarterback and the running back or whoever has the ball do in the backfield and just holding their blocks to keep the linebackers clean. Very few teams play that. Basically, since Dick LeBeau left Pittsburgh, no one really runs that sort of traditional 3-4 defense anymore. So I again, as Matt said, I do think it's one of those things where, it doesn't really matter all that much, but certainly you want to, regardless of what scheme you run, you want to tailor it to the personnel. And mainly we know of all the guys on this current roster, Grady Jarrett and Deion Jones are the two guys that you can absolutely say are, locks to be here for at least a couple of seasons. And both of those guys are better suited to playing more of a 4-3 style, traditional 4-3 style defense. But again, because there's so much hybridization now in the league, it doesn't really matter whether you're a 3-4 or 4-3. It's just as long as you sort of have the principles in line with sort of what you want to do. So, for those of you watching on the screen, there is the link for you to join the show if you want to get in your any last minute call-ins before we duck out. We'll probably duck out in the next 5 or so minutes. I'm scrolling through the chat to see if there's anything else.
Have you given much thought about a future defensive coordinator deploying Deion Jones more as a will linebacker than a Mike linebacker?
Yeah, it's certainly something I've been thinking about. Watching some of these recent games, I keep seeing plays where I'm like, oh, Deion Jones would be a better will linebacker, or I keep seeing snaps where Deion Jones would be a better will linebacker than a Mike linebacker. Especially if we do more of a 3-4 defense, I think that makes a lot more sense to get a little bit more of a beefier guy playing that Mike role.
Yeah, just keeping him clean as much as possible. That's something that I asked for any future defensive coordinator does with him. Hopefully they recognize that, because he's great in space. You keep him clean, you let him shoot through the gaps untouched. That's where he thrives. So That would be my one suggestion for alignments for the future of this defense is move Dion to will.
John Graham says, I asked you guys about 8 weeks ago how you felt about Freeman, the bad one.
Is he talking about you? Talking about you, right? I guess
it could be anything. At this
I
point.
want Aaron to be cut. Yep.
But he asked, if you were on board with him being cut in the offseason 8 games later, are you ready to part with him? I'm assuming he's talking about Devontae.
Yeah. We talked about it last week and then I think the week prior regarding him being traded. I was open to it because, again, I do think he's going to be a guy on the trade block, or not the trade block, the chopping block, being cut this offseason. So with all that in mind, in a lost season, why not try to get something from him? We don't know. I don't think we'll ever know what the offer was the Detroit Lions made to them, but the reports were that the compensation wasn't the issue. It wasn't that. And it was that they just didn't want to part with him because of, maybe what Aaron's saying with the pass protection, or, they don't necessarily, they can't trust Brian Hill, contrary to what Dan Quinn said yesterday in his press conference. So again, I'm a big Devontae Freeman supporter. I think the situation has a lot to do with, his production this year. The run blocking has not been good. The play calling has not been good. So both of those things are going to affect Devontae Freeman, and they have. And, now he's gotten hurt, which, again, no one should be using this injury as hindsight to say, yeah, they should have traded him. That's not the reason to trade Devontae Freeman. The reason to trade him was because, for cap reasons, for, future, whoever the play caller reasons are, they weren't going to keep him around. So those were the reasons to do it. You're not a contender necessarily this year. So, why not try to get something, even if it's a 5th round pick? It's better than nothing because you're not going to get anything when you cut him. So that's where I've been the last couple of weeks on that. Still am there. But yeah, I think, he's going to get cut, in my opinion, in 2020.
Yeah, I think I recall John's question, because I remember us answering a question about whether or not Devontae would be gone earlier this season, and I think we both said no, probably not. A lot happens in 8 weeks. That's why that's this game.
Yeah, back then we were I don't know why we were optimistic about their cutter as a play caller.
I think we were just coming off the Eagles game, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we were a lot more optimistic about everything back then. So I don't know if you can blame us too much, but I think for those people that didn't hear what we talked about last week, if you didn't tune in or listen to last week's show, basically the Cliff Notes is I was never necessarily anti-trading Devontae. It was just my point was that the coaching staff, I think, is less focused on the future and more focused on trying to win games now, and they deemed that Devontae Freeman would help them do a better job winning games now than certainly a late round pick in next year's draft. So to me, they were justified from that standpoint in not pulling the trigger on a trade. I think right now, I would think it's likely that he's going to get cut this offseason. And as Matt mentioned, cutting him now, the idea of trading him wasn't really for salary cap purposes, as so many people like to say, because as we explained last week, whether you traded him now or cut him later, it's kind of a wash from a cap standpoint.
In 2020, yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's one of those things where, and then, what are you going to do with an extra $3 million in cap space in November? It's not like you're going to go out there and sign, Colin Kaepernick or anything like that to move him to wide receiver and wind up saving your season. Or I don't know, there's nothing you're going to do from a roster standpoint with $3 million in extra space that's going to move the needle as far as 2019, which is where the coaching staff's head is. So I do think, cutting him later, this offseason is probably likely from whoever's, calling the shots. It seems, we'll see how the rest of the season fares, but it would seem that right now barring Brian Hill really just coming in and crushing it these next 7 games, I think we're going to probably see a new RB1 in Atlanta next year. And who that guy is, how much they're willing to spend, how high they're willing to take that guy in the draft is going to depend on who the new decision maker is. Does he believe in sort of a feature running back? Does he believe in more of a committee system? Again, all of those are unknowns at this point in time. But, barring a really strong finish from Devontae Freeman, I think it's probably inevitable that he is going to get cut this offseason.
It will be interesting, though, and again, I don't know where you stand now today on Dimitroff, but if Dimitroff is still the GM, does that increase Devontae Freeman's chances of maybe not being cut? And again, if Dimitroff is still the GM and he cuts Freeman, I just think, it'll confirm what you said, I guess, about them being more concerned about the here and now and trying to win as many games as they can. But I just think that would be a terrible look if he does, in fact, cut him in 2020 and he had a chance to get something for him in return. But, where do you stand on Dimitroff now? And do you think if he's still the GM in 2020 that maybe Freeman will still be around as well?
Again, as we discussed earlier in regards to Dan Quinn's job security, maybe this is a topic we can revisit in a couple of weeks, and certainly I'll have a different opinion then, particularly if the Falcons could rattle off a couple of wins. But at this point, like, if Dimitroff comes back, I can't really see him having that much control over personnel. Like, I just can't imagine Arthur Blank after stripping him of basically that power when he hired Dan Quinn to be like, oh no, I should have given you personnel control and you should be making football decisions all over again. Like, to me, sitting here today, and again, this is just purely me spitballing here, but like, I have a hard time seeing Dimitroff staying unless the Falcons hire a head coach who personally says, like, I want Thomas Dimitroff to be my GM. But I want to have, and someone like a Josh McDaniels, as Justin said earlier, where he's like, I know Tommy from my time in New England, and I can work with him. But I'm gonna be the big dog in that sort of relationship. So I just kind of feel like I don't really know how much influence Dimitroff, even if he does keep the job, is going to assert over what happens to the Falcons in 2020. I just feel kind of like if he's around, it's going to be more as, a puppet than necessarily a guy that really influences moves. But we'll have to sort of see.
It would be very much like one step forward, 2 steps backward if he would get more power in that scenario. Which, again, I agree with you. I don't think that's likely. I think if anything, it's like you're saying, someone either has a past relationship with him, like McDaniels or maybe Kubiak is in support of him just because of the standpoint that, he's an experienced guy, but he doesn't want to have all of it on his shoulders because of the stress, because of his health. And maybe he's okay with having Dimitroff, with him working in tandem in the draft room. But I think I agree with those sentiments about him and his future.
Yeah. I think we got time for one more. Wap Hill asks, how do you think the Falcons can beat the Panthers? Rise up, Shouty.
A lot of what we saw this past Sunday, part of their issue was the communication breakdowns, the mistakes, the blunders. We didn't see any of that. They played a fairly clean football game, outside of a few penalties that set them back on a few drives, offensive drives. Again, they played about as clean a game as you can play. So if we can get that type of performance and we have the communication on the back end, that's kind of how. Just the consistency, doing what they did this past Sunday, they can beat the Panthers. Because there's certain aspects, that we didn't get into much, but just to hit on a few of them. The Panthers, it's going to be tough sledding against the pass. They are a good defense against the pass, one of the best. Entering last week, they were 3rd in DVOA. Against the run, they were dead last. So I think, again, they might use a similar approach to try to, methodically move the ball down the field and keep the Panthers offense off the field, keep Christian McCaffrey off the field, because he can certainly beat you in and of himself. So again, I think we're going to see a similar game plan, and if they can execute it, I think they can win. But until we see it, I'm going to be skeptical, because again, we saw the peak in the Philly game, and then we had a stretch of 6 straight duds. So they need to do it consistently, but the blueprint's certainly there.
Yeah, even though I hate it, the idea of establishing a run, but based off of my very low opinion of Dirk Cutter and the observation that his offense works better when he can consistently run the football on early downs and get the team in the third and manageables, and allow this team to have an opportunity to convert, a 3rd and 4, a 3rd and 5, or whatever the case may be, as opposed to getting in 3rd and 10s. And as you mentioned, Matt, like Carolina has really struggled against the run. They've been gashed by a lot of big runs this season from opposing running backs, and so that suits well for Brian Hill. And we talked about Brian Hill earlier in this game, or early in this episode, and talking about his potential to impact. And this is going to be a golden opportunity for him against a relatively weak run defense. And we'll just have to sort of see. From an offensive standpoint, I know people look at sort of Kyle Allen and say, he's a bum or whatever, but correct me if I'm wrong. Did Kyle Allen start that game at the end of last season? Or was it the other guy that they had?
Taylor Heineke, I think it was.
Okay, it was Heineke. Okay. All right.
And then I forget who came, because someone came in after him, because Heineke got knocked out for a bit. But that's
why I want to say it was Kyle Allen. I felt like he played in that game for a little bit. But
I think it was Garrett Gilbert. Garrett Gilbert, one of those guys. Actually, wait. The final game in New Orleans, I think, might have been Kyle Allen, if not Garrett Gilbert. But no, I don't believe it was Kyle Allen. I don't.
Okay. All right. Doesn't matter. But basically, as Matt said, they kind of just have to do the same thing they did this past week. If the pass rush shows up again, like they did against New Orleans, and not, I guess, this is something Matt was talking about earlier. They've played well against good offensive lines like New Orleans and Philadelphia, but when we face some very questionable offensive lines like the Rams and the Cardinals and Seattle, not a whole lot to speak of. And, Carolina's offensive line is okay, but certainly a unit that if, we can get our guys going, we should be able to take advantage of. And, the scenario is basically start fast, get a lead. That helps this defense out tremendously because it allows them to basically pin their ears back, helps out this pass rush. It features a lot less Kamal Ishmael on the field. No offense to Kamal Ishmael, but, I think this defense is better when, Allen and KZ are our two safeties as opposed to Allen and Ishmael. And, hopefully the Falcons can, be the same defense that doesn't give up a ton of big plays, can get off the field on 3rd downs, can be stingy in the red zone, and then be able to play their style of offense, which is not what I would draw up, but certainly is decent enough that if they can, run the football and, do their thing.
So I was wrong. You were right. Kyle Allen did play in that game last year.
Okay.
He went 4 for 4 for 38 yards.
Okay. All right.
You're not going crazy. Yeah.
Okay. It doesn't matter. I am going crazy, but that's from watching a 2-7 team.
It'll do it too. Yep.
Yeah. So I think there's basically just all that to say is just do what they did this past Sunday, and they should be able to take care of business. If they don't, then you've seen what happens when this team doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, I'm excited to see Brian Hill in this one, because I think this is a great opportunity in this matchup, and he played well against them in last year's matchup. In a short amount of time, going for 70 yards. So I think he could be a guy. Maybe he gets 100 yards, maybe he gets a touchdown. Kind of has a breakout performance. I certainly know the fantasy football experts are tabbing him as a hot waiver wire pickup. So for all you fantasy players out there, I think it's worth looking into. to play him because the matchup is right for him. Sure, the blocking hasn't been great, but in the games where the opponent's run defense hasn't been good, the Indianapolis Colts one was a prime one earlier in the season. They have ran the ball well in those games. So I think that could potentially be in store this week. And again, I think that's a game plan that they're going to utilize. Is they're going to, as Aaron said, establish the run. And I think it makes sense, especially with Hooper being out. And, given that the Carolina pass defense is stingy, I think that's the way to go. And hopefully it pays off. So yeah, I'm excited to see Hill and maybe we see Allison, but I certainly think they have a chance. And there's reason to be optimistic following last week's performance. So, hopefully they're not feeling themselves too much. They do their work during the week, and potentially we can be talking about a little winning streak on next week's show.
Yeah, it would be nice to have one this season at least. So there you have it, guys. Appreciate everybody for tuning in, checking us out. All you guys, Khalil, Johnny, Justin, call it in, giving us your questions, giving us your thoughts, all the people that provided in the chat. Of course, you should like and subscribe this video, subscribe to Pro Football Central on YouTube. Check us out on Facebook, Falcons Central Radio. You can check out the show's Twitter handle at Falcons PFC if you want to submit questions ahead of the show for us to answer on future episodes. Check us out on Twitter. I'm at FalFans. Matt is at Matt Karoly, MattKaroly. And if you're looking for the audio version of the show, you can find all the links at profootballcentral.com as well as on the Falcon Central Radio Twitter page. We put all the sort of the audio links for you guys where you can subscribe. So
that's in the pin tweet, right? That we have now on the page.
It should be, yeah. Last I checked. So in the pin tweet, you can find us on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and I think those are the three main ones. And then if you use another audio platform for your podcasting, then we put the RSS feed in there for you to subscribe directly to it in your podcast platform of choice. So definitely looking forward to what conversations we're going to have next week after this Carolina game. Hopefully we can have another show where we're talking positives and pointing out the good things that the Falcons do, as opposed to always breaking down the all 22 of here's where this guy completely screwed up, which was pretty much the case for like 2 months on the show. Yeah. But I'm eager to see if this team can sort of show up. It's really about sort of, I guess, the mental fortitude or whatever you want to say moving forward, if they can start to string positive performances together moving forward. So appreciate all you guys for checking us out, and we will be back next week.